So the purpose of a clinical trial is to do two things, is to demonstrate, to assess the safety and the efficacy of a new therapeutic approach. And so this is done in a very phased manner over a clinical trial program. Firstly, the phase 1 trials are trials with a very small number of patients where gradually increasing doses of a new medicine are administered to patients to determine their safety and what we call the maximum tolerated dose to go forward in future testing. A phase 2 trial is also looking at the safety and the side effect profile of a new therapeutic agent, but is also starting to gather information about efficacy, how well that drug works in a particular setting. And the phase 3 trials are the randomized controlled trials designed to identify whether that new therapeutic agent is better than standard of care. Now, it's very important that people realize in these phase 3 trials that placebo control is only ever used where observation is appropriate, or where that placebo would otherwise be added to standard of care. Okay, so it would be completely unethical to do a phase 3 trial in someone who needed treatment and randomize them to a placebo. That's one common misconception that occurs in patients in terms of understanding phase 3 clinical trials. And then the phase 4 trials are usually done after post-market authorization to collect data about much larger patient populations. So clinical trials are there to demonstrate safety first, efficacy second. All right. Do people do better in clinical trials? There is some data out there that shows yes, they do, even if they're receiving standard of care approach. Probably because as soon as someone comes to a centre which is conducting clinical trials, they've come to quite an academic centre where the clinicians are very much at the cutting edge of therapies for their particular lymphoma, and there's probably robust peer review of the appropriateness of the patient going into the clinical trial. Because while everyone should be screened for a clinical trial, sometimes the clinical trial is not right for that particular patient. They might not meet the inclusion criteria, or they might meet a particular exclusion criteria, which means they can't be enrolled. Or the trial might not be asking the right question for that particular patient. So screening is very important rather than enrolling every patient on a clinical trial just because you've got the trial at your hospital. And peer review in the multidisciplinary team setting provides that sort of advocacy for the patient in terms of screening for clinical trials. Patients do better because once they are enrolled on the clinical trial, they get very meticulous follow-up, both by their haematologist and also their study coordinator. So that's partly the reason why patients might do better, even though they're receiving standard of care. But there's certainly no doubt that in this rapid time of quite significant transformation in the care of patients with lymphoma, that patients on clinical trials are very much at receiving cutting edge emerging therapies, which have often been shown to be efficacious in another population or a slightly different setting to that which the trial is being conducted. The costs of clinical trials are very much the same as the cost of receiving care anywhere within the health system in Australia. Although often with a number of our industry-sponsored trials, we are able to get cab vouchers for patients to come in and out for their treatment. But no patient should actually be paying at all beyond the sort of their own transport costs to participate in the clinical trial, beyond the usual script payments that they usually have to provide for supportive care medications. that they would otherwise be receiving. But even some of those get provided within the context of a clinical trial. Clinical trials generally do require more time in hospital and more blood test commitments, often more bone marrow biopsies, and that all needs to be discussed with the patient when they enroll on the clinical trial, comparing what is the approach that they will have on trial with what the approach would be if they were receiving standard of care. And for some patients, that extra testing is just too onerous, or it's too much to think about at a time when they're grappling with their diagnosis or the diagnosis of their relapse. It's very important that patients realise that participating in a clinical trial is an entirely voluntary process, not just at the time when they're being counselled about whether or not they wish to participate, but throughout the entire process of their participation. They can pull out at any time. It's also important that patients realise that their haematologist priority is them, not the trial, the best care for them. And if their treatment on trial is not going well and it is appropriate, the haematologist will recommend that the patient have dose modification on the trial, or indeed sometimes go off the trial because they need to go on to a different therapeutic approach. The best source of finding out if there's a clinical trial that's appropriate for you is to ask your haematologist. Actually be out there and say, are you aware of any clinical trials that I would be appropriate to be screened for, both at your hospital and hospitals around Sydney or New South Wales, or whichever city you're closest to, because I would be quite happy to be considered to participate in those trials. There's the Australian-New Zealand Clinical Trials Registry, but it's not very current in terms of listing of trials and site locations, and so because of that, that's what motivated us to create ClinTrial Refer, which is a free to download app, and anyone can get that at the app stores, and they can enter their own disease and scroll through and identify which clinical trials are currently recruiting for that particular lymphoma. But it's something that really needs to be discussed with your haematologist, because there are many trials that might be for your particular disease, but for which you may or may not be appropriately screened for. The other really important site are certainly the patient groups. Going to Lymphoma Australia, going to the WM Aussie's website, going to the Leukemia Foundation websites. They're very important sources of identifying what clinical trials are currently available.